Have you ever considered being a guest on a podcast? If not, you're missing out on a huge opportunity. But how should you go about securing your first podcast interview? And how can you be better prepared for it? So when the host hits the record button, your interview goes as smoothly as possible and you come across as an amazing podcast guest. I'm joined by podcasting expert Colin Gray to guide you through nailing your next podcast appearance on this episode of Architecture Business Club, the weekly podcast for solo and small firm architecture practice owners just like you who want to build a profitable, future-proof architecture business that fits around their life. I'm John Clayton, your host. If you're a small practice leader or sole practitioner in architecture, struggling to find clarity or reach your goals, consider working with me. I offer personalised one-to-one support through coaching, consulting and mentoring. This tailored approach helps you navigate your unique path to success. Whether it's growing your practice, working fewer hours, or building your team, I've got you covered. Just click the link in the show notes to book a call with me to discuss your options, or email John, that's Jon, at architecturebusinessclub.com for more information. Now let's discuss being an amazing podcast guest. Colin Gray is a podcaster, speaker, PhD, and founder of the podcasthost.com and Alitu. The podcasthost.com is a huge audio, video, and written resource on how to create a successful show. Alitu.com is a podcast maker tool designed to help you create your podcast in the easiest way possible and with full creative control, including call recording, audio cleanup, audio editing, building your episode, and hosting your show. To access free courses and resources to get started in podcasting, head over to thepodcasthostcom/start here. Colin, welcome to Architecture Business Club.
Hey, thanks for having me, John. Nice to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here. Colin, when you're not podcasting, you've got a ton of interests and hobbies outside of work that I know. Could you tell us a little bit about some of those hobbies? I know cycling's one of your passions in particular, isn't it?
Yeah, if the weather's good, or even if it's bad, to be honest, I get out on the bike as much as I can. I like if it's nice, I'll get out on the road bike. I love kind of going around and seeing the parts of the Highlands near where I live. And if it's muddy and wet, mountain biking's better in the forest with the mud and the wetness. So yeah, good fun either way.
Oh, that sounds awesome. Yeah, and where you're situated up in Scotland, I mean, it's a fantastic place in the world to be for the mountain biking.
Yeah, really lucky actually. Yeah, it's great. So yeah, plenty of places to go.
Yeah, down in Norfolk, it's a bit flatter, I'm afraid. So mountain biking and mountain walking is not the best hobby to have down in Norfolk. It's flat as a pancake.
Good for the road biking then.
Well, you say that, but because it is so flat, that even road biking can be quite tricky because of the winds coming in across the plains, if
really?
You like.
Good
so
protection,
yeah, that's it. It can be quite a challenge doing the road biking. But yeah, I miss the mountains though. I used to live in the northwest and go mountain hiking and things. So yeah, very, very envious of you being up in the Highlands.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. Very lucky.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about being a podcast guest. All right, how meta is this? It was odd talking about this on a podcast.
Absolutely. I feel pressure here as a guest, trying to tell people how to be a guest. So I'll do my best to perform.
Oh, there's no pressure. It's fine. We're all friends here. So why should architects in particular, because the audience that we have with the show, it's architects, architecture practice owners typically, and I dare say a lot of them haven't been on a podcast. They might listen to podcasts, but the vast majority of them probably haven't even considered going on a podcast.
Yeah.
So why should they consider going on a podcast?
Oh, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but I mean, the kind of core ones for anyone running a client-based business, really like architects or anything similar to that, is that it's one of the best ways out there to build authority and trust in your niche. So to get out there and really show who you are as a person. You can get your brand out there as much as you like, the name of your company, your branding, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, we all know people buy from people, and therefore they want to know the people behind this company, or at least they're even more likely to buy from a good brand if they know and like and trust those people behind the brand. So podcasting is such a good medium for that because it's an in-depth medium, which means that you get to spend maybe like half an hour or an hour with somebody in your ears. You're in their ears talking through your expertise, sharing your views, showing like who you are, what your values are, all that kind of stuff. And it's also a really personal medium. So you get to spend all that time with them, but equally, it's quite easy to speak on a microphone, just in a conversational way, just having a chat with the host of the podcast. And because of that, you come across as just a real person, just open and honest. And that combination of transparency, openness, honesty, combined with the length of time you spend with people, it just builds huge trust and huge kind of authority, and it makes people really get to know you, to trust you, and much more likely to buy from you as a result. I couldn't agree more. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of podcasts myself, also being a fellow podcaster. I think particularly that thing you mentioned about building trust. I think there was a study that Google did a number of years ago, and it's a figure that's been bandied around quite a bit about the amount of time that people need to have with you to build up that know, like, and trust before they're ready to buy. And that was something like 7 hours. You think, well, that's a long time, isn't it? But if you've been appearing on podcasts and you've been a guest and you share those with people, and they can build up, a few hours quite quickly if you've done a few podcast interviews. So it's definitely something people should explore for sure. Yeah, for sure. And if you're picking the right shows as well, when somebody is starting to get into a topic, if they're a podcast listener, that's who we're aiming for here as getting onto podcasts as a guest. I know from my experience, what about yourself, John? Like if you get into something or you're interested in a project or something new, you just dive into like 5 or 10 different podcasts around that topic. So if you can manage to kind of blanket cover those 5 to 10 podcasts in your niche, these people will hear you like again and again, and you'll build up that time without even having to run your own show. You can start to build that authority, that visibility really across a whole industry. It's just really useful. Is that yourself, John, as well? Like you always end up subscribing to 20 new shows every time you get into something new. Absolutely. Yeah. It's one of the first places that I go if I want to learn something new. Then, I head to my podcast player and I'll be searching on. I've got a long list of like a listening list, if you like, of episodes to work through. I never finish my list. It's terrible. Yeah, sometimes if I find a new one, I really enjoy it, then I will kind of binge it for a while, and then I might set it to one side and then come back to it later. But yeah, there's just so much great content out there now. Absolutely. Yeah, same. If somebody was thinking about, well, this sounds pretty cool, like maybe I could be a podcast guest, how should you pitch yourself to a show as a potential podcast guest? Yeah. I mean, this is worth talking back and forth because you'll have lots of experience of people asking to be guests as well, wouldn't you, John? But I find the way that I think about it is that it's well worth spending or taking if you find you want to get into this, it's well worth spending half a day or even a day, start to plan out who you are as a guest and what you have to offer. And the way this breaks down for me is the biggest part is really picking out 2 or 3 things that you have a unique viewpoint on. So something really specific within your niche. So as an example, John, like you'll have had lots of people in architecture on your show. What's like what stands out to you as one of the most unique kind of points of view somebody has given you as a guest? Like, have you had anything like that? Anything surprising? It's a great question. We had an architect on recently, and they'd recently taken a huge change in direction with their practice. They actually closed their original practice and started up a new practice. And their ethos was all around specialization and collaboration. So that was something that I think a lot of people within the industry aren't quite as keen to embrace, particularly the idea of collaborating. I think really what they were talking about was with the specialization, just kind of sticking to the bit that they do best and not feeling like they had to do everything like a full service, that they could just do part of a project and they could work with another partner practice that could help deliver the other part. So that was something that was a little bit of a different viewpoint that I think there's a lot of mileage in it because it's not. I don't think that's that unusual outside in other industries, but I think there's in architecture, a lot of people think that, we're expected that we just have to offer this all in one thing.
I love that. That's a really good example. Yeah. So there's somebody who has really taken on something that other people would disagree with potentially. And that's when you know that you're onto something in terms of a way to pitch yourself. If it's something that you can speak about, you have experience in, you can tell some stories around, and you can show how you've helped sort of build success with this approach. But then again, somebody else might say, oh no, I don't like that. I wouldn't do that. That is gold. So it's like anything that people get, that's different. That's what you call differentiation, because you can be different. Like every architect will say, like, we provide great quality service. That's not differentiation, because no one will disagree with that. But if it's something like, we don't do the planning permission sides. We just do the drawings for you, And other people will say, oh, but we do. So it's the disagreement that suddenly makes it something that's quite unique. So yeah, I love that example. So that's how you stand out to podcasts. You bring something that is just a little bit different, some kind of different viewpoint. And I would say you can almost certainly think of 2 or 3 of these for yourself. If you're out there listening, like there'll be 2 or 3 things that you talk about that you maybe disagree with other people in your industry, friendly disagreement with other people in your industry. And they're the things you want to talk about. So note them down and then start to build it out, like build to sort of 2 or 3 sentences that really pitches how you have expertise in this and how it can help the audience. And that's where it finishes up. It starts with that unique viewpoint, but it finishes up with how this helps the audience. And that's how you get in front of podcast hosts. Because if you can say, like, here's something different that I talk about, you probably haven't had your show before, and here's how I think it'll benefit your audience, those are the 2 parts that really hook people in to get you on the show. And I find that when we're working with people who are creating new podcasts, who want to start promoting it as a guest, you can do that in half a day, even a couple of hours if you can know yourself quite well, but half a day at the very most, you can put together a really good pitch around that. I love that. And that exercise that you've recommended people do, I mean, really that could underpin positioning themselves as a thought leader, that they've got something that it defies convention, that they have a unique viewpoint on something that actually would not only be really powerful in terms of a pitch to an industry podcast, but also that's something that they could use as a basis for any other content. Like if they wanted to position themselves as a thought leader in the industry that's got something to say, that's got some different ideas to share, that would be awesome to also share that stuff on other platforms as well. So really, really valuable exercise. Yeah. Yep, definitely.
In fact, I'm going to add that to my to-do list, Colin, because I think I probably need to drill down on that a bit more myself.
It's, and it takes, nearly everyone can. And even if you've done it before, it's worth doing it every 6 months or every year at least, because you come up with new things all the time. Like things change, trends in the industry, or even just the way you think or your experience. Like a lot of these unique viewpoints can come from the way you did something, whether it was deliberate or not. Maybe it was like completely messing something up and trying something different as a result of that. And then that can create a unique approach because you say, this is something that a lot of people do, but it didn't work for me. And therefore I changed it this way. And so maybe that's going to work for you. So yeah, it's definitely worth reviewing on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Just a final point, I guess, on the pitching. I mean, you mentioned earlier about, I must get a number of pitches coming through to be on this show. I do get pitches that come through, and often they come through as an email, and most of them are terrible.
Yeah.
They're blatantly just a template email that's exactly the same that's sent to every single podcast, and they just swap out and say, oh, I really loved this episode, copy paste, and I loved the guest, copy paste, drop this in. And often it's from agencies, like the architect or person is employed like a PR agency to help get them on podcasts, and their pitches are terrible. I had one just last week, and it was nothing to do. It was loosely somebody for the construction industry, but this is an architecture podcast about business, and there was just no connection or correlation between what this show is and what that get. I mean, the guest could have been perfect fit for another show,
but they really hadn't done the research. They hadn't gone to the trouble to listen to the trailer or to read some notes about the show or to even listen to an episode, you know. So, yeah, that's it. It doesn't take much to stand out, actually. There's two sides, isn't it? The trouble is that many podcast hosts just ignore pitches altogether because they get so many of those crappy ones. So you have to find a way to make it stand out as something different from just a pitch. It has to be some proper personalization at the start, like actually giving them some feedback on a recent episode, a topic that they actually talked about in the recent episode, as in you have to have actually listened to it. But I mean, you've got such a higher hit rate by doing that it's worth. I mean, you're probably listening to these shows anyway because it's in your industry, most likely. So maybe there's 10 podcasts that you listen to in the architecture industry. So pick one that you're going to concentrate on for the next week. Listen to a couple of their episodes, pick out one or two things that you can give them feedback on, that you can ask a question around, and then say below that, by the way, I would love to contribute. Here's 3 things that I can talk about in a unique way, and here's the benefit that'll give your audience. That kind of thing can make a huge difference because it's so different from the copy and paste pitches that you and me both get tons of. Yeah, don't do that, guys. Don't copy and paste. If there's anyone listening to this episode that thinks, like, wow, I'd love to be on the Architecture Business Club podcast, I'm expecting some good quality pitches now.
Oh, yeah.
After that advice that you've shared, Colin. So being interviewed on a podcast, though, like if you do pitch to go on a podcast and you are successful and you do manage to secure a guest appearance on a show, actually being interviewed on a podcast, it can feel nerve-wracking if you've never done it before. So what would you recommend we could do? The things we could do in advance of the interview itself to be better prepared?
Yeah, there's no question, especially when you're on your first sort of 5 or 10 interviews, or you've just not done it that much before. It can be a bit scary. The key is, I think, around this prep, it's actually that serves double duty. It gets you on the show when you're doing all this prep around the uniqueness, your value, all that kind of stuff. But equally, having done that prep makes you feel more prepared, which actually I find always settles the nerves of people, especially when they're in the early days. You can take it an extra step, though. Like one thing that I'll often recommend people do, and I still do these days even, is you tee up the host with actually some prep questions. Like, so for example, the normal thing is that as a guest, the host will send you questions. So you're going on a show, the host will say, well, here's 10 things I want to ask you. And that's fine. That actually helps settle the nerves a bit. So if the host doesn't do that, by all means, you can get in touch and ask, like, what are the types of questions you want to ask me? But even if they don't, and you can also do as an extra separate prep, is to send some of your own. Like say, here, so we've agreed to talk about this one unique viewpoint that I have. That's great. Here's 4 or 5 questions that I find really tee up my best stories here, my best examples here, my best, how I can describe the frameworks, the workflows. Here's maybe 3 questions actually that walk me through, that help me walk you through the workflow and mean that I don't have to speak for 5 minutes on my own, Instead, I can say a little bit and then you could ask this question and that jumps me into it and it'll all still sound quite natural. So I find that little thing, so the prep in the first place around the topic itself makes a big difference, but then actually talking to the host back and forth and giving them a few tee-up questions actually makes a big difference too, because you're comfortable with those. They're things that you know exactly what's coming, you've got good answers to, and that can really settle the nerves a fair bit too. And I suppose beyond that, do you ever do things like, vocal warm-ups or, just some deep breathing or anything before a show, John? Do you ever take any of those kind of more general, mindfulness, wellness type approaches?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say like I go through like a whole breathing routine or anything, but I usually just make sure that first I'll do sort out the tech. So often I'll like restart my computer, make sure there's no updates going on in the background, and then I'll get set up and logged into the software that we use nice and early. I always have a glass of water to hand in case I need to clear my throat or anything. And I do usually, we always plan questions in advance. So we always make sure that we know what the topic's going to be and that we send questions to the guests as well, to make it as easy as possible for them to show up and for them to feel
relaxed and comfortable on the day, particularly if it is somebody that hasn't been a podcast guest before. But yeah, I'll take a few deep breaths and maybe do a few do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, tis or whatever.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's a lot of people think of it as a bit kind of woo-woo or whatever, but I think it's becoming more mainstream nowadays, meditation, breathing exercises, that kind of stuff, isn't it? And it does make a difference. If you just take 10 sort of mindful breaths, just, breathe in slowly, breathe out slowly, and just concentrate on your breath like you would if you were meditating on something, it really does lower your blood pressure a bit, ease some of that tension. So that can make a big difference. But I will comment though, you did this really nicely as well, John. Like, you do have a really good prep process. So we obviously chatted before the show. We talked through the topic. We went into something unique. So the fact that, a lot of the time people would expect me to just say, do you want to just come on and talk about podcasting? And I'm like, all right, but there's quite a lot in there. This isn't going to be any kind of unique viewpoint. Do you want to kind of dig into one particular place? And it's usually me leading that as a guest. But you didn't. You were like straight away, okay, so what really specific thing can we dig into? And we ended up on this topic around guesting. And then we dug into a few questions, and you were talking, both of us together were talking about a few good questions, a progress for the episode. And that took us, 20 minutes, wasn't that long. And then sent them through afterwards. So I had this list of questions in front of me, and I just took 10 minutes beforehand. Even as somebody who speaks to this stuff all the time, I still took 10 minutes beforehand because I had these questions to just note down a couple of things I want to make sure I covered on each one. And all of that, just makes you so prepared that it's almost hard to be nervous. Yeah, it just makes so much difference. I think that one of the things that you mentioned there, which I wish I'd thought of several months ago, I've been a guest on a number of other podcasts, and sometimes the preparation was better on some than others. But with the benefit of hindsight, had I thought with some of those shows that weren't proactive about sharing questions in advance, if I'd have just sort of taken that initiative and said, well, look, we're going to talk about this topic, but here's a few questions that would nicely lead in and nicely lead into this topic and make sure that we cover these points. And so we can have it so it's conversational, because otherwise sometimes you can get caught off guard as a podcast guest that you might have agreed that there's a particular topic you're going to talk about, but then you can get a question that's got thrown in there that can sometimes just catch you a little off guard. Yeah. And occasionally I've come off the back of those interviews and just thought, oh, I could have answered that question better. Like if I knew that the question was going to be asked in advance, I would have had a little bit of time to think about it, and I would have read through those questions before the recording, and I would have responded and given a much better answer, which is then better for the listeners, because at the end of the day, it's about the listeners, isn't it? We want to make sure that the content is right for them and is resonating with them and worth tuning in and subscribing. Totally. I mean, you're going to invest probably an hour into the interview. Even if it's a half-hour interview, there'll be a bit of start time, end time, whatever. So it's going to be an hour of your time. So you can so much amplify the impact that episode will have by just investing even as little as half an hour. I would suggest even an hour just in thinking about those questions ahead of time, sending them through. The funny thing is, the person that's hosting the podcast will be an expert in that general topic, I'm sure. Usually a person hosting a podcast on something, they'll know a lot about that topic, but it's your unique viewpoint. They're getting you on because you know more about something particular in that topic or about your experience. So why let them, why let them create the questions or lead the flow of the episode when it's not their expertise, when it's not their experience, when it's not their story? So that's why it's kind of funny why a lot of interview shows, even when somebody's a really good interviewer, they can tend to follow those rabbit holes much more effectively. But even a good interviewer can still take an interview off track and still miss great little questions, great little avenues to attack because it's not their area. So it's your responsibility to make sure this interview goes as well as it possibly can. And I really don't think it takes that much prep around it. Just as we've talked about, just those questions, just those unique viewpoints makes such a difference. I've shared that I've had a couple of experiences at being a guest that could have been better. They weren't a disaster. They could have been better. Have you had any experiences like that yourself, Colin? Have you had any times when you've been a guest where you thought, oh, that was a disaster, or that didn't go very well?
Remember, don't forget to download the Architecture Business Blueprint, the step-by-step formula to freedom for architects, architectural technologists and architectural designers. You can grab the blueprint without any charge at architecturebusinessclub.com/blueprint. And if you're enjoying this episode, then please leave a 5-star review or rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, I've had some bad interviews. Yeah, I mean, some through my fault, not their host's fault either. But I mean, the things that always stand out to me, the ones that always stand out to me, are when the host is really, it almost seems like they're not even listening to the questions. They're not. Sorry, the answers, I should say. They're not even listening to my answers. They'll just say, "Yep, great," and then ask someone else entirely different. And often, you're good at this, John. I've had lots of experience in this as well. So I feel comfortable in asking you a question back, things like that. As a guest, it's a real kind of superpower, actually, to turn it into a conversation as opposed to just like a one-way thing. So asking you something back, it's actually, it creates a better chemistry. It creates a better back and forth. And there's so much of that. It's kind of like, I've asked questions back to hosts before, and it's really put them off, like taking them off guard and like completely flustered them. And to be fair, that's probably partly my fault back then, because that was in the early days. I wouldn't warn that I might do that. So yeah, there's been stuff like that where, people are so formulaic. They'll have their 7 questions in front of them and they're not going to deviate from them in any way. So it just takes away so much of the spontaneity, the dynamism, the conversation, the chemistry. That's what people come to podcasting for. I would read a blog post if I just wanted 7 questions, 7 straight answers. But I want a conversation. I want experience. I want stories. I want all of that stuff. So yeah, it's funny. Happens to the best of us, I guess. We've shared and discussed some great ideas there for how people can be better prepared in advance. Do you have any other thoughts for the day of the recording itself? There was a couple of things that you mentioned there that, you asked if I did as a host, things like breathing exercises, that sort of thing. Is there any other recommendations that you have for someone as a guest for the actual time of the recording? Yeah. I do think it's really worthwhile doing a wee vocal warm-up at least, even if it's just a few tongue twisters. Like, just say some of your favourite tongue twisters, like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. I could say, didn't practice that well enough, but just a few of them makes a big difference. And there's I don't know if there's an official name for it, but I call it the fire engine warm up as well, where you close your mouth and you hum and you just go up and down. So it's like, and I find that just do that for about a minute. It makes a huge difference to how warm your vocal cords are at the whole range, and gives you so much more range in your voice, actually. So you sound far less monotone, you sound far more up and down and all that stuff. It makes a big difference. Yeah. So those actually, they really are worthwhile doing. And the other thing you mentioned as well, John, like the tech, like don't turn up and say, I've got an interview at 1. So I can just open up my computer at 3 minutes to 1 and just hit the link and go. It'll go wrong like 2/3 of the time. It does for me. Even John, you and I had some technical issues because of my computer setup. Even though I do interviews like this, like all the time, it's still messed up. And we started 5 minutes late, so I'm not following my own advice here. But open that interview link at least 5 minutes early and make sure your camera's set up. You make sure you're on the right microphone. Make sure it's all quiet around you. Things like that makes a huge difference too. Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree with those recommendations. Something that I started doing as well is when we send the email, like the confirmation emails through about the guest booking, we send an email to the guest, also including a link for instructions of how to use the recording software. So we currently use StreamYard. So if you haven't used it before, it's a great idea to just in advance to just log on to the website, check it out, and familiarize yourself with it a little bit. And I mean, the tech isn't that complicated. I mean, we're talking microphone, headphones, but if you're not familiar with the software, and things do go wrong. I mean, you mentioned your tech issue today. I had one too. My computer decided to do an update beforehand, and then when I logged back in again, my mic had stopped working. So, these things happen to all of us. Yeah. I think the key there's allowing enough time, isn't it? Just not turning up sort of 2 minutes before and expecting it all to go perfectly.
That's it, exactly. Yeah, 5 minutes minimum.
Yeah. So we've been invited to a show. We prepare for the interview. We turn up in good time on the day of the recording. The recording goes absolutely amazingly. So what then? After the recording goes live for a guest, I mean, is that it for a guest, or would you recommend that there's things that, as a guest, that you could do to help leverage this great opportunity that you've been given, once the podcast has been published?
Yeah, definitely. There's a couple of things go into this, I think, John. I think it's how much effort you put into promoting that show for the host. So actually putting a lot of your kind of marketing and growth equity into promoting that episode, and we can jump into that. But there's also the fact that it's a resource that you can use as well. So you can ask the host. So on the first, that it used to be, it was in the early days of podcasting, it was one of the best ways to grow your show. It was actually to go and either to go and guest on other shows, and therefore you can talk about your podcast, or the opposite way around. If you get guests in, those guests will hopefully promote that episode of your podcast to their whole audience. And it's kind of died away a bit. People have become so almost professional guests that they go on too many shows that they just can't promote them very effectively anymore. They either promote too many of them, or they just don't do it anymore because it's too much work. So if this is your early days of guesting on a podcast, take advantage of the fact that you can make yourself stand out as a guest by actually putting a bit of work into making sure that episode succeeds. So if you have an email list, if you have your social channels, if you have a website, a YouTube channel, your own podcast, then if you put a bit of work into making sure that podcast episode is the most listened to episode of the last few months for that host, that stands out. They'll see that in their stats. They'll see that you've sent a bunch of listeners to that episode, and it really got some new people listening to their show. And that stands out. The benefits there are a couple of things. First, you've got a friend for life. This person will help you out as much as you want in future. But equally, they'll then recommend you to other podcasts as a guest. And this is one of the best things. Podcasters know podcasters. John, it's a big part of how you and I know each other. So that person will then recommend you. You can say to them, by the way, any other podcasts you know that might benefit from this kind of topic that I'm talking about? And that podcaster will go, of course, because you helped me grow my show, so I have no problem recommending you to go on other shows. So he'll then give you an email intro for, 2 or 3 other podcasts that he knows that's on the same topic. So yeah, I think that works really nicely as a first one. These days, John, do you get a lot of people of your guests helping to promote the episodes quite well, or did you find that experience that kind of died off a bit?
It's mixed, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, we're 40 something episodes in, I think.
Yeah.
Around about that, and most of the time, we do create some promotional materials and resources for every episode, and I will share those. But the main platform that I'm on online is LinkedIn. So I'll usually share a few posts, screenshots, maybe some short form videos like reels, that sort of thing. And we do share those with the guests as well. So they get all of those assets that they can also share.
Yeah.
I would say probably 75 to 80% of the guests don't do anything with it.
Yeah.
And then the sort of 20, 25% of the guests so far have been on it. They've planned it out in their social media. They've been sharing the reels on Instagram and Instagram stories and putting posts on LinkedIn. And I don't take that for granted. Obviously they are helping themselves, but I think it's the ones that have an appreciation for the opportunity that stands before them and understand marketing. I think those guests tend to be the ones that have been keener to share stuff, and to plan it out. Yeah, that kind of tallies with my experience. Like a sort of 1 in 5 for sure. Yeah, that'll make a bigger effort. But those people stand out then, don't they? Yeah.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
Yeah. The other side to me is the reuse of that content too. Something that a lot of guests do not do. Like, John, we're talking here about being a podcast guest, potentially, even ahead of starting your own podcast. It's a way of getting in front of new audiences without having to go to the effort of starting your own pod and growing your own audience, all that kind of stuff. But these episodes that you go on, normally, the host, will be absolutely delighted if you reuse a lot of that content and post it out there on your own channels, because it still showcases their content, it still showcases their channel. It's worth asking just in case. But you can take that episode, you can ask the host, like, can I get a copy of the video for that, the audio for that? I'll try and put it out on some of my own channels. Almost always they'll jump at that. And then you can use that episode in all sorts of different ways. Like, you can cut out your own clips. Like, you're talking about doing that, John, for your own promotion. But as a guest, I might have different clips that I really enjoyed and might want to send to my audience. You can post the whole thing, maybe on your YouTube channel, take out segments. You can use it in all sorts of different ways. And again, that builds a bit more relationship with the host again, because like I said, you are still promoting their show at the end of the day, but you're giving yourself tons of content equity, tons of content to work with that helps you engage your own audience and really start to grow that in your own channels too.
That's a great suggestion. Another thing that that guests can do, often depending on the hosting platform, often there'll be like a little podcast episode player you can grab a piece of code and very easily you can embed that on your own website. So they could even take that piece of code and put that podcast on a blog on their own website. Or they could,
sure.
Sometimes people will put together, say, like a Spotify playlist of the different episodes that they've been a guest on. And then they can share that with their prospects and their own audience. So there's all sorts of things that they can do with this content. So
yeah. Do you know one thing I did, which actually worked really nicely for me at the time I did it, was my About Me page. When especially if you're running a client business or something like that, you write up your About Me page, but you can make it a bit personable. You could even record a video or an audio yourself, but by far the best resource I found that talked about me and showcased who I was and my experience and stories and stuff was one of the best interviews I'd been on that just talked about my background. There was a guy I got to know in podcasting really well who interviewed me once. He was a really top class interviewer, and he just dug into all sorts of stuff behind the scenes, like about, my experience, how I had got to where I'd got to, all that kind of stuff. And I used that on my About Me page. I embedded his episode onto my site. It showcased his podcast for anyone who was interested, but equally it gave an insight into who I am and how I work and all that kind of stuff that there's no way I could have kind of drawn that out just by myself. It took somebody else doing it to get that.
Oh, that's a brilliant idea. I love that. So if somebody wanted to start their own podcast, what would be your top recommendations?
The recommendations are always very simple, and they're centered around that exact word as well, about keeping it simple. As in, a podcast is all about the content you put out. It's all about the words you say, your ideas, your viewpoints, your personality, all of those things. It's not in any way about the gear, the software, publishing strategies, all that kind of stuff. It's solely about the content. Once you've mastered the content, once you're starting to create the best possible content you can, once you understand your audience back to front, their questions, their wants, their needs, their pains, you can create content that really engages people. Then, by all means, you can optimize by getting better microphones, better mixers, better software, thinking about publishing, all that kind of stuff. But in the early days, the first 10, 20 episodes, it's all about that content. So on that basis, pick a microphone and just plug it into your computer and forget about it. Just choose a USB one. I think you've got the exact same one as me in front of you there, John, which is the Rode Podcaster.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yep, it is. Yeah.
So the Rode Podcaster, great choice. £100-something, so high-ish budget, but it just plugs in and then you forget about it. The Samsung Q2U is a great lower budget, still sounds great as well. And then just record into one of the various platforms out there that help you automate a lot of it. So StreamYard does a fair bit. It does the video and the audio. You've got, Alitu is our software platform. Alitu does recording, but also does the cleanup. So we automate like the noise reduction, leveling, all of that kind of stuff. Designed really to help people just concentrate on the content. But there's other options out there. So there are a couple of options, but there's loads of them. But try and just find one simple platform that does as much of that technical automation as you can, and then just concentrate on the content. And I often suggest the first 10 episodes, once you've got that gear and software set up. And by the way, sorry, John, I'll just a quick plug as well. Like that link you said at the start, the thepodcasthost.com/start here has two different things, one email course and one page, both totally free, which will guide you through all of the the simplest gear and software setups. So go over to that one if you want to just get the detail on what these things are. But in terms of the mindset, the thing I often talk about is going with almost a live recording mindset for your first 10 episodes, if not way more. And what I mean by that is forget about editing, forget about retakes, forget about any of that stuff. Pretend that as soon as you hit the recording button, that you're live on air on a radio station and you just go for it. There's a few things that comes into this. First of all is it takes away that crutch of editing. So that you actually get better really fast because you listen back, you hear some of your crutch words, your ums and your ahs, and everyone's got them in the early days. So don't worry about that. So it helps you improve your speaking style really quickly in the early days. And the second and the most important part is it takes away the most time-consuming, annoying, podcast-killing process of your early days, which is editing. Like that is just what kills so many podcasts is they'll record their first episode and then they'll end up spending 8 hours desperately trying to cut out every little and every little and every little mistake and every little trip over the tongue. And it's just not needed. One of the great things about podcasts, as we've mentioned a few times, is how open, how honest, how human they are. And all of these things are human. If you take out too much of that stuff, you're sanitizing it and taking away quite a lot of your humanity. A lot of what makes people connect with you is the fact that you're a flawed, real human being that does trip over your tongue every now and again. And you do say ums and ahs every now and again, although you can go too far in them and you want to improve them. But does that make sense, Sean, in terms of, I often say that, like, commit to that in your first 10 episodes and it makes things so much easier.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And it's great advice. Yeah, keep it simple. Don't overthink it. I think particularly with podcasting, one of the things that trips people up is the tech. They'll overthink it and spend weeks trying to decide which microphone to buy and which software to use. And you can always change it later. It's better to just pick whatever is the simplest solution to just get started.
Yeah, it's a really good point about just getting started too, because that is where, like I mentioned, the content is where the value is. The content is what makes it a success or a failure. And there's the only way to get good at creating that content, whether it's the planning of that content, how you speak to your audience, just your simple speaking skills, all that kind of stuff. The only way to get great at all of those things is to do it. There's no way to learn that ahead of time. It's just you have to actually do it. And therefore, the earliest you can buy a microphone and just start speaking into a microphone, just start planning out episodes, just start thinking up topics and playing with what style, what format, what type of angle you want to take on your show. The earliest you can start playing with that, the better, because that's what makes a great show. So yeah, just pick something and hit record and get out there.
It's great advice. Yeah, absolutely. So, Colin, what would be the main thing that you'd like the listeners to take away from our conversation today?
I think the main thing is around the thing that so few guests do, which is that prep, really. It's just to go away if you really think this is something that can work for you. And I think in a client type based business like architecture, I think it's even more powerful than in most places. So I think it should work for just about anyone listening. Is go and spend even a couple of hours just thinking, like, what do I talk about? Like, what are my views on architecture? What could I offer that's relatively unique? And that may be a little bit scary at first. Often when I'm working with people on that, like they think, well, I don't know, what is unique? Like, I'm not sure what, but generally, if you start thinking through it and spend that time and think through the last few conversations you had with some colleagues, like what were some things that they found interesting or dug into, or what were some things you disagreed with them potentially on, or, what do you hear in the media in your area that aren't necessarily your viewpoints that you can give another sort of angle on? Those kind of things are gold. So putting that prep in, taking that first step of spending those 2 hours, that could give you the confidence you need to really start to reach out to some shows and get some appearances.
That's brilliant. Yeah. I think, the idea of kind of doing that prep work is so important. And because I think when you're thinking about, what have I got to talk about that's different to anybody else? We all have stuff that's different. Like they'll have, as a architect, they'll have processes that they do, ways that they work with their clients. There'll be all sorts of things that will be different to other practices. They might not realize it, but if they kind of take some time to just think about it, that I'm sure that they'll uncover all sorts of gold there that they can talk about.
Yeah. Often it can come from those mistakes. Often it can come from things that went wrong. So like if you had a bad experience with a client by accident sometime, then what did you develop to stop that happening again? And often that is something that is unique to yourself. Yeah, for sure.
Oh, that's a brilliant one. Yeah. I mean, in terms of stories, I mean, people love stories. Like if you've got good stories that you can share that, and particularly when things haven't gone so well, or you made a mistake or something.
People love a disaster.
They love a disaster, but if you can sort of share that and share a bit of vulnerability, look, hey, we're not perfect. It's like we made a mistake here, but this is what we learned from it. I mean, that makes really good content. Absolutely.
That's perfect. Yeah.
So was there anything else you wanted to add about the topic that we haven't already covered in the conversation?
No, I mean, like we said, John, we planned this out quite nicely ahead of time, which I hope is a lesson for potential guests out there too. So no, we've covered everything I think we wanted to.
Awesome. Well, I just have one last question I'd like to ask, and this is something I ask of all of the guests. I love to travel and to discover new places, and I just wondered if you could tell me one of your favorite places and what you love about it.
Oh, good question. Same. Actually, I love to travel as well. Find new places too. Often to my detriment, I'll sacrifice going to old places that I love just for the sake of going somewhere new, and then it won't live up to what I own sometime. But hey, that's part of life, isn't it? One place I'm really fond of, and we do go back to again and again, actually, is the northwest of Spain. So a lot of people don't really go to that part of Spain, but Galicia, it's called, up in the northwest, just above Portugal. And it's a cooler part of Spain, so you can go over the summer. My wife actually has a relative and uncle that moved up there, married a Spanish lady and lives up there. Well, actually lives in a few different places, but they summer up there because it's cooler than the place they live normally. Like it usually gets 40 degrees dry heat where they live normally. So they go up there in the summer, and it's just such a beautiful place. It's quiet. It's not very touristy. It's got lovely beaches, great surf on that side of the coast as well. And the food, I just love Spanish food. It's so good. It's so kind of fresh and wholesome. And I always love spending a week there with my family, maybe once every couple of years at least.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Yeah. I've had, well, I would lose count. I had lots of childhood holidays in mainland Spain. And,
nice.
So we've had got a lot of memories from Spanish holidays, and more recently, my family and I we've had a few holidays over in Mallorca that we've really enjoyed as well. We've got a place that we like to go back to time and again. So the food's absolutely amazing, isn't it?
Oh yeah, so much.
Well, Colin, thank you so much for being a guest on the show and sharing your expertise. Could you remind everybody of the link so that they can access those courses and resources about podcasting?
Yeah, thanks, John. It's been great to come on. Really appreciate you inviting me. If anyone wants, we've got a 7-day email course around starting a show. We've got a 7-day course around growing a show. So even if you already have one, it might be worth a look. And we've got a couple of different guides to getting started. It's all totally free. So you go over to thepodcasthost.com/start here. That's thepodcasthost.com/start here.
Awesome. And if anyone would like to reach out and connect with you online, where would be the best place to do that?
I'm same as you. Actually, LinkedIn is about the only social media I use these days. And even that is relatively sparingly, but if you connect with me over there, I'll see it eventually and be able to get back to you. But do you know what? Actually, I shouldn't say that. The best place to actually get me is in our community. So that link, that Start Here link, actually is a front page of our community, a private community for podcasters or people wanting to guest on podcasts. We've got a space in there for that. And I'm in there quite a lot. So if you actually have any good questions or want to follow up on any of this stuff, by all means, join the community and you can fire me a message in there.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thanks again, Colin.
Cool. Thanks, John.
Next time, I'm joined by Robert Woodburn Park to talk about communications in architecture. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Architecture Business Club. If you liked this episode, think other people might enjoy it, or just want to show your support for the show, then please leave a glowing 5-star review or rating wherever you listen to podcasts. It would mean so much to me and makes it easier for new listeners to discover the show. And if you haven't already done so, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss another episode. If you want to connect with me, you can do that on most social media platforms. Just search for @Mr. John Clayton. The best place to connect with me online, though, is on LinkedIn. You can find a link to my profile in the show notes. Remember, running your architecture business doesn't have to be hard, and you don't need to do it alone. This is Architecture Business Club.